Hey everybody, it's Damien here from Guitar Journey, and today we're going to go a little bit deeper into our study and our understanding of music theory. Music theory, what makes music sound the way it does? And of course, how can we use this information, how can we use this understanding in our own playing? Today we're going to talk about understanding intervals. And if you understand your intervals well, you will be in command of any music theory concepts that later come your way, okay? Now, before we get started, I want to suggest a couple of prerequisites for this video. At a minimum, you absolutely must understand your chromatic scale extremely well. Remember your chromatic scale, C, C sharp, D, D sharp, it's that. Really knowing your chromatic scale, both the sharp notes and the flat notes, absolutely essential for understanding any aspect of music theory, okay? I have a video on the chromatic scale. I'm going to put the link down below in the description to this video here. Strongly recommended, okay? Additionally, I also suggest that you understand the basics of how to construct a major scale and that you understand the basics of the chords that you expect to see in any given major key, okay? I have a video on that as well, and that description, that link will be in the description below as well. Okay, so regarding intervals, it's strange because usually when people are wanting to learn about music theory, they're talking about the circle of fifths, they're talking about all these exotic scales, whatever. And people don't usually focus on intervals as a specific topic, and I think that's a mistake. That's in fact why I gave this video the title that I did, because for a lot of people I think studying and really understanding intervals are the missing link, the Rosetta Stone in their music theory study. It unlocks so many other things. It's just so important to understand intervals. They're the keys to building chords. They're the keys to understanding what chords will work with which scale. They're the key to understanding composition, to understanding chord substitution, chord extensions, and just so much more. Now, in our study of intervals, we're going to run into this idea of enharmonic notes. And of course, you probably know that enharmonic just means that the same pitch can go by two different names. For example, an E flat note can also be called a D sharp note. And which name we'll call it depends on the context in which we find that note. And that idea of context is really about how a note is functioning. Think about that word, function. I actually thought about making a whole separate video just on this idea of how a note or a chord functions, but I really thought it would make more sense to include it in our discussion of intervals. They're very much intertwined with each other. Now, you can loosely define function as how a note or a chord sounds, how it feels, how it behaves in relation to the other notes or the chords around it. Maybe a slightly more formal definition of function would be how a note or a chord relates to a given tonal center. Now that sounds just a little bit technical, so let me give you some examples, okay? Let's say I play this note right here. This note right here is a B note. Okay, it's just an ordinary B note, no big deal. Now, I want to ask you a couple of really stupid questions. Was that B note major or minor? Which scale degree, in which key was that B note? Now, of course, there's no way to answer these questions. It's just a B note. But there's a really important lesson here. Without any other context, that B is just a note. It only has meaning, you could say. It only has function when it's considered in the context of other notes. If I play a C major scale and I find myself on a B note, which is the seventh and last note of my C major scale, remember, C major scale consists of the notes C, D, E, F, G, A, B. So here I go. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. That B note tends to want to do something. It tends to want to resolve upward to the octave C. Here it is again. You don't want me to end there. You want me to go. Ah. Much better, okay? Now, on the other hand, if my B note is in an A major scale, my B note will be the second scale degree. Remember, A major is A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp. And if I play an A major scale, when I hit that B note, it doesn't seem to want to move in the same direction that it did when it was in the C major scale. Same note, but a completely different context, okay? When B was surrounded by the other notes in the C major scale, our B note kind of wanted to do a certain thing. It wanted to resolve upward to the octave C. But when our B note was surrounded by the notes that make up A major, our B note really didn't seem to want to do that. So let's think numerically for a minute. In the key of C major, as I said, our B note is the seventh scale degree. C, D, E, F, G, A, B. Okay? C major. Now on the other hand, in the key of A major, as we said, B is actually the second scale degree. A major is A, B, C sharp, D, E, F sharp, G sharp. And like we saw earlier, when I just played the B note all alone with no context at all, there was nothing special about it. It was just a B note. It didn't really want to do anything, okay? But when our B note served as the seventh scale degree in C major, it wanted to do a specific thing to resolve upward to the octave C. But when it was the second scale degree in A major, maybe it wanted to do something different. And this is a very simple explanation of the concept of how a note or a chord functions. Truth is, in a major key, that seventh scale degree will pretty much always want to resolve upward to the octave. It doesn't matter what key we're in. Nothing magical about C major. The seventh scale degree generally wants to resolve upward to the octave. It just feels like it does. And on the other hand, it doesn't matter what key we're in. The second scale degree doesn't have that same kind of pull. Okay? It doesn't pull in that same direction. So in a nutshell, the second scale degree functions differently from the seventh scale degree. And that's a pretty good illustration of the concept of how a note functions. A note functions a certain way given the context that it's in. Now, a couple of moments ago, I mentioned that we're going to have to keep this concept of function in mind when we're learning our intervals, and especially when we're dealing with enharmonic notes. Remember, enharmonic note is note that can go by two different names, like E flat and D sharp. Same pitch, two different names. Which name we're going to give to that note depends on how that note is functioning. It depends on the context. And if this sounds a little weird, that a note can go by two different names, depending on the context and the function, I have a really silly, non-musical, kind of real-life analogy for you to consider, okay? Let's take an average person. We're going to call her Sarah Jones, okay? And Sarah Jones is a financial planner. And when she's at work, she's dressed very professionally, and her clients and her colleagues refer to her as Ms. Jones. And over the course of the day, she does the job, you might say the function, of a financial planner. When Sarah gets home, she changes out of her business clothes, she puts on some jeans and a t-shirt, and she says hello to her kids, who happily refer to her not as Ms. Jones, of course, but as Mom. And for the rest of the evening, she performs the functions not of a financial planner, but of a parent. She's called a different name, Mom instead of Ms. Jones, and she has a completely different function, but it's the same person. And while that sounds maybe a little bit of a silly example, it's actually pretty darn similar to what we're talking about here with enharmonic notes, okay? After all, the Sarah Jones in my example, it's the same person. Whether she's in the financial world, she's called Ms. Jones. When she's at home, she's being called Mom. She has different functions, but it's the same person. And yeah, notes are like that. Depending on where you find them and in what context, how they're functioning, you might call them one thing, you might call them another thing, and they're going to kind of behave differently. Okay, so function in our understanding of intervals is very, very, very important. Okay, as far as studying intervals themselves, it's pretty straightforward, okay? You can see the different intervals up on the screen, and you're just going to have to commit these formulas to memory, okay? Just look at the interval guide on the screen. You just need to memorize these. But you can see that a number of intervals can be called different things. For example, a distance of 8 half steps, which is 8 frets on the guitar, can be called an augmented fifth or a minor sixth. Which do we call it? Yeah, it depends on the context, okay? But this distinction is very, very, very important, okay? What we're going to do when we practice our intervals is we're going to have a 2-step process, okay? A 2-step process. When we're trying to figure out what note is a given interval from another note, for example, what note is an augmented fifth from C, we might ask ourselves. We're going to have a 2-step process. The first step is we're simply going to count the number of half steps up from our starting note using the chromatic scale. The second step is that we're going to look at the name of the interval in question, an augmented fifth or whatever, and we're going to make sure that the name of that interval is reflected in the number of letters from our starting note to our destination note. Okay, let me explain that a little bit more. Remember that there are 7 letters in the musical alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And yeah, on occasion, you know, some of those notes are going to be sharped, some of those notes are going to be flatted, whatever. But there's still only going to be 7 letters, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And so just as a super quick example, if I just say to you, okay, what's a third up from C? And I don't care if it's a minor third or a major third, whether there's sharps or flats involved or whatever. If I say to you, what's a third up from middle C? I need to be thinking about 3 letters. 3 letters, okay? We called the interval a third, doesn't matter what kind of third, we called the interval a third. And so if we're looking for the note that is a third above C, we're going to be looking for some kind of E note, some kind of E note. And again, in this second part of the inquiry, we're focused on counting letters. So if we said a third up from C, well then 3 letters, C, D, E. C, D, E. There's our 3 letters, okay? But let's do a more involved example, okay? Let's say we're practicing our intervals and we really decide to ask ourselves, okay, what is an augmented fifth from C? Well, first, remember the first of the 2-step process, we count our 8 half steps. You can see according to your interval guide, an augmented fifth equals 8 half steps, okay? Little side note, super quick. Because we're talking about the distance from one note to another, we do not count the note that we're starting on, okay? Let me say that again. Intervals refer to the distance between 2 notes. So it wouldn't make any sense at all counting 8 frets to count the note that we're starting on, okay? So again, we're asking ourselves, what is an augmented fifth above C? An augmented fifth is a distance, of 8 half steps. So when we count this out from C, we say C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F, F sharp, G, G sharp, and there's my 8 half steps. An augmented fifth above C is G sharp. But why don't we call it A flat, or does it even make a difference? Well, yeah, as a matter of fact, it does. It's a very important difference. Remember, our rule for naming the note is that whatever the interval happens to be called, we need to be counting that many letters. Whatever the interval is called, we need to be counting that many letters of the musical alphabet, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And because we're calling the interval an augmented fifth, we need to be counting out 5 letters, C, D, E, F, G. Now let's not confuse this with counting the half steps or anything like that. That was the first part of the process. We're on the second step in the process. The first step, yes, is to count the number of half steps. But the second step is that once we land on a certain note, having counted the half steps, we got to figure out what to call it. In this case, either G sharp or A flat, depending on the name of the interval. And as I said, the name of the interval in this case is an augmented fifth. And that means we've got to have 5 letters, C, D, E, F, G, okay? So one more time, first we count out the number of half steps, the number of frets, if you will, and then we call a given note either by the sharp name or the flat name, depending on the number of letters based on the name of the interval, okay? Once we've traveled the number of half steps, the second part, again, I'm emphasizing this a lot, we consider the name of the interval in question, we make sure there are that many letters from our starting note to our destination note, okay? So, getting back to our question of why we call an augmented fifth above C a G sharp and not an A flat, where C is 1, C, D, E, F, G is 5, a fifth, okay? Where C is 1, G is 5. And whether it's G sharp or G flat, whatever, if it's some kind of fifth, we have to have 5 letters, okay? Had we called that note A flat, well, again, count the letters, C, D, E, F, G, A. That's 6 letters. And so if we called the note A flat, we'd actually be describing a minor sixth. And yes, you can see in your interval guide that a minor sixth is also 8 half steps, but a minor sixth functions very differently from an augmented fifth. And the distinction really does matter. Let's do one more example. Let's say this time we're trying to figure out a diminished fifth rather than an augmented fifth. Well, we see in our interval guide that a diminished fifth is a distance of 6 half steps, 6 frets on the guitar if you like. We'll start again from C. So what is a diminished fifth from C? We count those 6 half steps, C sharp, D, D sharp, E, F. Do we call that 6th half step, that destination, do we call it F sharp or G flat? The answer is we call that destination note a G flat, because again, whatever the name of the interval is, in this case a diminished fifth, you need to have that many letters involved. If we had called the note F sharp, that's only 4 letters, C, D, E, F. We would really be talking about an augmented fourth. And as you can see in your interval guide, an augmented fourth and a diminished fifth are both 6 half steps away from the starting note, yes. But remember, whatever we call the interval, it has to correspond to the number of letters. Diminished fifth from C has to be called G flat because again, C, D, E, F, G. Okay? There we are. I know this is kind of technical, kind of dry, but I promise you it's super important. Super important. Think about it for a minute. We're going to use intervals to build chords all over the neck. We're going to use intervals to alter various scales and understand why that scale works with certain chords. We need to understand intervals to understand compositional concepts such as chord substitutions, key modulations, and more, tons more. Even things like how you voice a certain chord, what inversion it might be in, that kind of thing, or which notes of a chord you choose to include and which notes of a chord you might choose to omit in a given fingering on guitar. All of this is dependent on an understanding of intervals. The bottom line is, if you really take the time to know your intervals cold, any future study of music theory will be much, much easier. That's why it's the Rosetta Stone, it's the missing link. Understanding function and intervals, I just can't emphasize enough how important it is, okay? So commit to a daily practice of just picking a note and trying to name a few intervals from that note, okay? Maybe one day say, okay, I'm going to start on an A note. What is a perfect fifth from A? Okay, what is a minor seventh from A? What is a major third from A? You get the idea. Do this as much as you can stand to do it. I know it's not exciting, but if you're serious about understanding theory, you must understand intervals. All right, thanks for sticking with me. I know these deeper theory concepts can be challenging, but I promise you they're worthwhile. As always, Please hit the subscribe button. Please subscribe to the Guitar Journey channel. As I often say, we are building a community here, and I would love to have you along as we travel our respective guitar journeys. And also, please leave a comment. I really mean it when I say that, even if you disagree with me or you want to point out something that I may not have mentioned. Comments allow us all to learn from each other, and that enriches all of our guitar journeys. So again, please leave a comment. That's all I got for you today. Thanks so much for watching. Have a great day.